Beginning in 1972, MASH ran for 11 seasons before ending with a series finale that was one of the most watched television programs of all time. And while I did watch MASH when it was on CBS's primetime lineup, it was during its syndicated run here in Salt Lake City that I really grew to love the show, which would air 2 times a day on KSL television. Once in the evening and then, later on, at night. In fact, at 10 p.m. KSL would broadcast this very important message on the screen. "Parents," a voice would say, "it's 10 p.m. Do you know where your children are?" Of course, my folks always did. We weren't allowed to stay out late in our home. And then the KSL Eyewitness News would start. Norse, Welty, and James were the anchors. These guys were iconic in the 70s and 80s in Utah. And as part of their sign-off, they would say, "Stay tuned for MASH." And then behind them, MASH would start and slowly transition to a full screen. At least that's how I remember it happening. Back then, CBS didn't have a viable late-night talk show to compete with Carson, so KSL, which was our local CBS affiliate, relied on MASH to compete with the then king of late-night comedy. And compete it did, at least in our home. As we grew older and became teenagers, bedtimes were abolished, but unless it was a weekend, my folks had a fairly hard and fast rule that MASH was pretty much the last thing that any of us were allowed to watch on television before retiring to our bedrooms. And because of that rule, well, pretty much everyone in our home grew to love this show. As I think back, that cast really was amazing. This show truly was Alan Alda's shining moment, but everyone, and I do mean everyone, who made up the show's central cast of characters had reason to be proud. Especially Gary Burghoff, who played Walter Eugene Radar O'Reilly for the first 7 seasons of the show. He was also the only member of the television cast to appear in the 1970 Robert Altman film that the TV show is based upon. Radar was the company clerk, and in many ways, the absolute heart and soul of the show. While many of the other characters used sarcasm and cynicism as a means of deflecting the emotional trauma that they were experiencing, Radar still looked at things with a sense of innocence. Burghoff played Radar in a way that he was allowed to be naive without being dumb. Radar simply wanted to see the good in things. He'd been raised that way. So with all that said, it was really disappointing for us MASH fans to have Gary leave the show after the 7th season. And when he did return during the 8th season to film a special 2-part farewell episode, fans couldn't help but wonder aloud, would Gary pull a Don Knotts and return to MASH for an episode or 2 each year, the same way that Knotts did on the Andy Griffith Show? But that was not to be the case, because you see, Gary had made the very difficult decision to walk away from the day-to-day demands of an industry where you can never give enough. Why? Well, the answer is pretty simple, really. You see, while Burghoff was away from home filming MASH, a California brush fire nearly claimed the lives of his wife and daughter. Fortunately, Providence stepped in, and at the last minute, firefighters were able to stop the fire, but not before it made its way onto Burghoff's ranch property. In fact, according to the article that I read in TV Week magazine, the fire stopped just short of the back door. Can you imagine that? Being separated from the people that you love the most, unable to protect them and comfort them. I can only imagine that those were the feelings racing through Gary's mind while he was on the MASH set and apart from his family. Here's what he said. "It made me realize that anything could happen to them at any time, and I think we should be together as much as possible." Because of that, Gary made the decision to leave MASH. It wasn't easy, but sometimes making the right decision can be a difficult thing to do. From time to time, when Burghoff felt that he was able to take a job offer without compromising family life, he would still show up on the small screen. When After MASH debuted, Radar O'Reilly made a couple of appearances on that show. And around the same time, he even filmed a pilot for a potential spin-off called Walter, where Radar becomes a member of the St. Louis Police Department. Over the course of the 80s and early 90s, Burghoff made a few appearances, but really did seem to be true to his word. Along with family time, he continued to cultivate hobbies such as painting and music. As an avid fisherman, he holds the patents for a couple of inventions related to that sport. And Gary is also an avid stamp collector. From 1995 to 2010, he focused on family and his own general well-being, and as such stayed away from the entertainment industry entirely. It wasn't that he held any sort of disdain for show business, but rather he just decided to gracefully retire on his own terms instead of anyone else's. That said, Burghoff did come out of retirement, just briefly in 2010, to star in the faith-based film titled Daniel's Lot. That movie's central character is forced to reevaluate his priorities, what is really important to him, after a chance meeting with a local pastor, played by, yep, you guessed it, Gary Burghoff. Is it any wonder that this movie was appealing to him? While the circumstances in the film may have been different, Gary had done exactly the same thing decades ago when he decided to leave MASH behind. And just in case you're wondering, that's not to say that everything has gone perfectly for Gary. Shortly after quitting MASH, his first marriage did end. Clearly, he was right to want to focus on family. While that brush fire may have been an immediate call to action for him, I've got to believe that he felt that perhaps if he were able to be home more, he and his wife could work things out. Burghoff would marry again in 1985, but that union would end as well 20 years later. Gary has 3 children from those 2 relationships. And being that he really is a true family man, I've got to believe that those 3 kids, now adults, well, they mean everything to him. So that's it. Radar really was a fun character, and MASH, well, with or without Radar O'Reilly, it was a heck of a great show, although it was definitely better with him. Now it's your turn. Please share your memories in the comments section, and while you're at it, I'd love a thumbs up if you enjoyed this video, and I would be absolutely honored if you would consider subscribing to my channel. I talk about music, movies, and television, mostly from the 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s. You know, the good stuff. But most importantly, and as always, thank you so much for watching.